What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Appreciate you guys tuning in for another video. If you guys are new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future videos. We're still doing 3 videos a week right now, so we don't want you to miss out on any of those future videos. So today we are diving into a viewer question, and I'm going to do my best to answer that for you guys, but that leads me into this. If you guys watching this video have any ideas for videos, any questions, anything that you'd like to see on the channel, please drop it in the comments down below. I keep a running list and would love to help answer your questions or help you learn something about bass fishing that you guys can apply to your own fishing and get out on the water and catch some bass. You know, that's the goal of this channel, is to help you guys catch more bass, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you may have. So today we're talking about glide baits, why you need to be throwing a glide bait in the fall time of year. It's one of the, it's getting more popular for sure, but a glide bait is kind of overwhelming, kind of a little bit scary to think about throwing a glide bait and when and why you need to be throwing it. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into here today, when and why you need to be throwing a glide bait in the fall. Okay, so a lot of the videos on the channel lately have been more geared towards, obviously, fall fishing, but more towards grass fishing. You know, fishing fisheries with matted grass, throwing frogs, punching, buzzbaits. You know, that's a lot of the fishing that I'm doing right now. You know, down in the Tennessee region, you know, a lot of the lakes matted out grass, the lake levels start dropping a little bit. So you're throwing a frog, you're punching, you're throwing, you know, buzzbait, big topwaters, things like that. But, you know, going along with that, one of the things that I'm always looking for this time of year, and this even applies to when I'm picking out an area fishing in the grass, is I'm always looking for the presence of big gizzard shad, or gizzard shad in general, this time of year. You know, I feel like the biggest fish in the lake, biggest bass in the lake, love to eat those gizzard shad, and especially during the fall. You know, those gizzard shad kind of move a little bit shallower. You know, lately I've been seeing a lot of them in the grass, kind of eating off of the grass. So there is a lot of big forage for those fish to eat in the same areas that those bass live. You know, a lot of times throughout the summer months, those gizzards get offshore, and that's, you know, a lot of times I feel like why the bass end up offshore on the ledges and things like that. But now you see those gizzard shad up in the grass in those same areas where you're catching, you know, a lot of fish shallower. And this also applies to lakes without grass. You know, they like to get up more on that, you know, shallow rock or gravelly or bluffs or things like that. You know, the gizzard shad tend to get a little bit shallower into the fall months. And that's why it's an excellent time to pick up one of these guys right here, a glide bait, and get out there and throw him around. And you know, the reason a glide bait works so well, obviously, it's a big profiled bait. So it has a lot of drawing power. It can pull a fish off of a piece of cover. You know, if you throw this bait, you know, by a lay down tree, for instance, and there's a bass sitting deep inside that, and he sees this glide bait come by, he's going to actually come out of that tree to check this bait out, potentially eat it. Whereas, you know, if you were throwing a jig, for instance, you would have to really pick that apart. It's a much smaller profile, and it doesn't have as much drawing power to get that fish to come out of the piece of cover and come check out your bait. So that's the number one reason, you know, you're throwing a glide bait, is the drawing power. It really likes to call fish out of places, and they'll move a long way to come check this out. So obviously it imitates those big gizzard shad that are in those areas. So that's the number one key. You want to find those areas that have gizzard shad, and this is going to target the biggest bass in the area for sure. So this specific bait right here, this is the War Panda Nug. This is I would say this is a little bit on the smaller side in the grand scheme of things of glide baits. This is a 7-inch bait. It's a very choppy bait. So what that means is it goes side to side very far and doesn't, you know, on a slow retrieve, this bait's going to go side to side, very choppy, And, you know, that's something that I love in a glide bait. That's what I'm looking for. So, you know, the cool thing about this particular bait is each one is unique. So Kurt over at War Panda, he does unique color drops. So every few weeks, he is dropping a brand new color, and it may be a one-of-a-kind color. It may never be available again. So you're able to get some really cool looking baits, and that's exactly what I've done. I've spent more money than I care to admit on some of these beautiful looking nugs here lately. Seems like every time he comes up with a new color, I end up purchasing one of them just to add to the collection. But this one right here, this is one of my favorite colors. This one came out a couple weeks ago, but you'll just have to stay tuned. I'll put a link in the description down below if you're interested in checking out the nug, and you know, you'll have to just stay tuned for the next drop on social media or the website, and hopefully be able to pick one up in one of those. So like I said, this is a little bit on the smaller side of glides, and that's really what I like this time of year, because, you know, generally speaking, the fall is going to be a tougher time of year for bass fishing. So I want a bait that, you know, will target, you know, a 2-pound bass all the way up to a 6, 7, 8-pound bass. And that's exactly what this size glide does. You know, if you picked up one of the big giant, say 10, 11, 12-inch glide baits, you know, you're really kind of eliminating that smaller, on that low end side of the fish that you're targeting. You know, that 2 to 3, 4 pound range really isn't going to eat a big giant glide like that. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always exceptions to the rule, but I'm saying generally speaking, I want a bait that has the drawing power, that can catch big ones, but can also just get bites, and that's exactly what this bait is right here. So that's when I'm leaning towards a smaller glide. You know, in the fall time of year, that's when I rely heavily on the smaller glide. You know, I would say more spawn, post-spawn, immediate post-spawn. That's when I would pull out the bigger stuff. You know, and you're targeting a specific size of fish with that, but this smaller glide is a better overall, especially this time of year. You know, a lot of the gizzards I'm seeing are that, you know, 6, 7, 8-inch range, and that's exactly what this bait right here imitates perfectly. So, you know, one of the overwhelming parts about throwing a glide bait is going to be the equipment that you throw it on. You know, I like to throw it, it's actually a Dobbins Fury. It's a $7.95 swim bait rod. It's a fairly cheap glide bait rod. I think it's $100 and $120, somewhere in that range. And, you know, it has a handle that you're able to cast it. And, you know, it has enough power that you can handle, especially these smaller glide baits. It seems to be perfect for that. So that's what I'm throwing this time of year, and I really think you should be trying a glide bait this time of year. It's just something that, you know, it gets bites. It really gets bites this time of year and catches fish that really won't bite anything else. You know, like I kind of mentioned that scenario earlier about, you know, a bass hiding in a laydown that will come out and check out the glide bait. Well, really, you could throw a spinnerbait or, you know, pitch a jig into that laydown, and that fish really isn't going to pay any interest to those other baits. But a glide bait will draw those fish out this time of year, and you need to be throwing a glide bait in the fall. So more on the equipment side of things, I always throw my glide baits on fluorocarbon line. You know, I know I've heard the battle back and forth. Do I throw it on braid? Do I throw it on fluorocarbon, mono? For me, you know, I feel like the fluorocarbon is actually stronger when it comes to throwing a big bait like this, because if something were to happen in your reel, you backlash, whatever, the fluorocarbon has a little bit more play, a little bit more stretch that you're able to, a little more forgiving, if you will. Whereas braid, you know, if you get a sudden backlash in your reel, it can pop and break and send that, and then you're losing a high dollar bait that you don't want to do. So I'm throwing 20 to 25 pound fluorocarbon. Most of the time I'm using 20. There is certain times where I may up to 25 if I'm throwing it really close to wood or, you know, heavier cover like that. But I like the castability of 20 pound. You know, I use Seagar and VizX fluorocarbon. That's what I'm using on there. And then I'm tying on my War Panda nug and getting after it. So hopefully you guys learned something from this video about fall glide bait fishing. Maybe we can get some on the water videos here soon. You know, that's something that I'm hoping to do a little more of this fall. So I'd love to get an on the water video with the glide bait, kind of show you guys exactly what I'm fishing for. So let me know in the comments down below if you'd be interested in seeing that. But appreciate you guys tuning in. As always, leave me those likes and comments down below. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and we'll see you guys next time.